December 3, 1944, Iwo Jima Air Base, Bonin Islands. Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka's hands trembled as she reviewed combat reports from the previous day's interception mission over the Pacific. Her squadron had lost 6 aircraft in a single engagement with American B-29 Superfortress bombers, yet not one bomber had been shot down. The reports made no sense. Her pilots had executed perfect attack runs, approaching from optimal angles, firing at close range where missing was nearly impossible. Yet the bombers had returned fire from positions where no human gunner could physically sit, tracking her fighters with impossible precision, hitting aircraft that should have been in blind spots. She read one pilot's account 3 times, unable to reconcile what he described with everything she understood about aerial combat. The guns moved without human hands, tracking us through positions no man could occupy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Akiko had been one of Japan's first female fighter pilots, trained in secret at a facility in Manchuria where the military desperately sought any advantage against overwhelming American air power. She had logged over 300 combat hours, survived 12 major engagements, and earned the respect of male pilots who initially dismissed her. She understood aircraft, understood combat, understood the mathematics of interception and deflection shooting. What she was reading in these reports violated everything she knew. The American bombers were defending themselves with technology that seemed impossible. Guns that fired without gunners, turrets that rotated to track targets with mechanical precision no human could match. The first hints had emerged 3 months earlier, in September 1944, when Japanese Army Air Force units began reporting unusual observations during attacks on B-29 formations over China. Pilots described tail guns that continued firing after the tail gunner's position had been clearly destroyed, belly turrets that tracked aircraft through angles human spines couldn't bend to observe, coordinated defensive fire that seemed to anticipate attack patterns before fighters committed to their runs. Initial reports were dismissed as combat stress, the confusion of high-speed engagement, where seconds felt like hours and perception became unreliable. But as reports accumulated from different units, different theaters, different pilots with varying levels of experience, a disturbing pattern emerged. At Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Headquarters in Tokyo Imperial University, before the war, he had studied aeronautical engineering, understood both aviation and technology in ways most military officers did not. He recognized that American engineering had achieved something his own nation's industry couldn't match: remote fire control systems that eliminated human limitations from defensive gunnery. His report, stamped with the highest classification level and restricted to senior command only, concluded that Japanese interception tactics were obsolete. Every doctrine, every training manual, every attack profile was based on exploiting blind spots and overwhelming human gunners. Against aircraft that had no blind spots, and gunners who never tired, never flinched, never lost tracking through human error, Japanese fighters were approaching slaughter. The B-29 Superfortress represented American engineering at a scale Japan couldn't comprehend. The aircraft cost $600,000 each, more than the entire annual budget of some Japanese air units. Development of the B-29 program had cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that would produce atomic bombs. The bomber was pressurized, allowing crews to operate at 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, fluid speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, and carried defensive armament that transformed it into a flying fortress that actually lived up to the name. But the most revolutionary aspect, the technology that Japanese pilots would die discovering, was the Central Fire Control System, a computerized gunnery network that coordinated all defensive guns through remote sighting stations. The system worked through a revelation in military technology. Gunners sat at plexiglass sighting stations inside the pressurized fuselage, using periscopic sights to track enemy fighters. They weren't manually aiming guns. They were providing targeting data to an analog computer, the General Electric's Central Fire Control System, which calculated lead angles, adjusted for airspeed and altitude, and directed remote turrets to fire with mechanical precision. A single sighting station could control multiple turrets. The Central Fire Control Officer could override any position, directing all guns toward the most dangerous threat. The aircraft had 5 remote turrets, 2 on top, 2 on the belly, 1 in the tail, mounting a total of 12 50-caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. For Japanese pilots trained to exploit blind spots, to attack from below where belly gunners couldn't depress their weapons far enough, to approach from angles where human reaction time gave them seconds of safety, the B-29 Central Fire Control System was devastating. There were no blind spots. Turrets could rotate 360 degrees, depress to vertical angles, track targets through positions no human gunner could physically occupy. The analog computer compensated for aircraft motion, wind speed, temperature, even the curvature of bullet trajectory at extreme ranges. Gunners fresh and alert because they weren't cramped into turrets, weren't exposed to wind and cold, weren't struggling with physical discomfort that degraded accuracy. Lieutenant Tanaka learned the truth not through official briefings, which never came, but through accident and observation that would haunt her for the remainder of the war. On December 8, 1944, her squadron intercepted a damaged B-29 returning from a raid on aircraft factories near Nagoya. The bomber was losing altitude, trailing smoke from one engine, flying alone and vulnerable. Tanaka led her flight of 4 Nakajima K-84 Hayate fighters in a textbook attack, approaching from the classic 6 o'clock low position that should have been a blind spot. She watched her pilots execute the attack perfectly, closing to 300 meters before opening fire. Then, she watched the bomber's belly turret rotate impossibly, track her fighters with mechanical smoothness, and destroy 2 aircraft in a burst of fire that lasted 3 seconds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She pulled away from the attack, climbing for altitude while her mind struggled to process what she had observed. The turret had moved too fast, too precisely. It had tracked aircraft through an angle that would have required the gunner to be lying on his back, looking almost straight down, while simultaneously operating the gun. Physically impossible, unless there was no gunner in the turret. Unless the guns were being aimed by someone elsewhere in the aircraft, someone comfortable and protected, using sights and controls that removed human physical limitations from the equation. She returned to base and requested every piece of intelligence available on B-29 defensive systems. What she learned, pieced together from incomplete reports, captured documents, and observations from pilots who had survived encounters with the bombers, revealed technology that seemed like science fiction. The Central Fire Control System wasn't classified by Americans because they didn't believe Japanese industry could duplicate it even if they captured intact examples. The technology required precision manufacturing, miniaturized electronics, analog computing capability, and systems integration that Japan's war-strained economy couldn't produce. American engineers had created the system assuming air superiority, designing for performance rather than protecting secrets, confident that showing the technology didn't mean enemies could match it. They were correct. Japanese intelligence had detailed specifications for the system by late 1944, obtained from crashed aircraft and prisoner interrogations. Interrogations, none of it mattered. Japan couldn't build it. At Tachikawa Air Technical Arsenal outside Tokyo, engineers examined salvaged components from a B-29 that had crashed on a training flight near Chengdu, China. The aircraft's central fire control unit, remarkably intact, was disassembled and studied. Engineers documented every component, photographed every circuit, measured every specification. Their report, delivered to the Army Air Force Technical Command in January 1945, concluded that duplicating the system would require manufacturing capability Japan hadn't possessed even in peacetime. The precision ball bearings alone were beyond Japanese industrial tolerance. The analog computer used components that required manufacturing precision measured in thousandths of an inch. The electrical systems demanded standardization and quality control that Japanese factories, many now dispersed into caves and tunnels to avoid bombing, simply couldn't achieve. Lieutenant Tanaka requested transfer to Training Command, where she could warn new pilots about what they would face. Her request was denied. Experienced pilots were too valuable to remove from combat, even if their experience told them that tactics being taught were obsolete. She found herself in an impossible position, leading pilots into combat using tactics she knew were suicidal, unable to explain why without revealing classified intelligence that command refused to disseminate. The military hierarchy believed that informing pilots about the central fire control system would destroy morale, make them hesitant, create defeatism. Better to let them die believing victory was possible through spirit and determination than live knowing the technological gap was insurmountable. She began keeping a private journal, documenting observations that official reports wouldn't include, recording the truth that Japanese pilots deserved to know but would never be told. Her entries from December 1944 through March 1945 provide remarkable insight into a military force discovering, too late, that they were fighting with obsolete tactics against revolutionary technology. December 15, 1944. Lost 3 more aircraft today during interception over Osaka. The bombers flew in formation, and when we attacked, every turret on every aircraft seemed to track us simultaneously. Coordinated fire from positions no human gunner could occupy. Our pilots are brave, skillful, determined. They are also being sent to die because command refuses to acknowledge that bravery cannot overcome technology. January 7, 1945. Briefed new pilots on B-29 interception tactics. Taught them to attack from below, from the blind spots. I know there are no blind spots. I know these tactics will kill them, but orders are orders, and truth is classified above my clearance level. I am teaching young pilots to die, and I cannot tell them why. January 28, 1945. Spoke with Major Matsumoto, who showed me intelligence reports on American central fire control systems, remote turrets, analog computers, gunners sitting in comfort while their weapons track us from positions they cannot see. We are attacking aircraft defended by machines, not men. How do you teach pilots to fight machines that calculate faster than humans can think, that track targets through angles human bodies cannot bend, that never tire, never miss, never hesitate? February 14, 1945. Squadron strength down to 8 operational aircraft. We receive replacements. Young pilots with 40 hours of training, boys who should still be in school. I teach them what I can in the hours we have. I do not teach them about the central fire control systems because that knowledge is classified and would only terrify them. They will die discovering what I already know. The guilt is overwhelming. March 3, 1945. Tokyo firebombing last night. Over 300 B-29s flying at low altitude with minimal defensive fire because night fighters cannot catch them. Each bomber's central fire control system creates a sphere of defensive fire that makes traditional attack profiles suicidal. Our night fighter pilots try anyway, because what else can they do? 17 aircraft lost for 5 bombers downed. This is not combat. This is execution. The technological revolution that American central fire control systems represented extended beyond just the B-29. By early 1945, American fighters were being equipped with lead computing gun sights, radar ranging systems, and fire control computers that transformed gunnery from an art into a science. Japanese pilots who had trained for years to develop the intuitive,
skill of deflection shooting, the ability to aim where a target would be rather than where it was, found themselves facing opponents whose aircraft calculated lead angles automatically. The American K-14 gun sight, introduced on P-51 Mustangs in late 1944, used an analog computer to calculate the correct lead angle based on target range, size, and angular velocity. The pilot simply needed to frame the target in the sight's reticle, and the computer would position the aiming point precisely where bullets would intercept the target's flight path. This seemingly simple innovation represented a gulf in capability that years of training couldn't bridge. A novice American pilot with 50 hours of training could achieve accuracy that Japanese aces with 500 hours couldn't match, because the American pilot wasn't relying on human skill, but on computational precision. The machine did the difficult mathematics of ballistics. The pilot simply had to keep the target in the sight and press the trigger. This democratization of gunnery skill through technology meant that every American pilot was effectively an expert marksman, while Japanese pilots relied on individual skill that varied wildly and took years to develop. Lieutenant Tanaka encountered this technology firsthand on March 19, 1945, during an interception mission against carrier aircraft raiding Curie Naval Base. Her flight engaged a formation of F-6F Hellcats, and she found herself in a turning fight with an opponent who should have been easy to defeat. The American pilot was making basic mistakes, using too much rudder and turns, allowing his airspeed to bleed off, presenting multiple opportunities for a killing shot. She maneuvered for position, lined up what should have been a perfect deflection shot, and fired, missed completely. The American pilot, recognizing he was in danger, simply pointed his nose in her general direction and fired a short burst. She watched tracers track her aircraft with impossible precision, felt impacts as rounds punched through her wing, and dove away trailing fuel. She returned to base with her aircraft barely controllable, made an emergency landing on one wheel and a wingtip, and sat in the cockpit afterward trying to understand what had happened. She had made a perfect shot, using skills refined through years of practice and hundreds of combat hours. She had missed. The American pilot, clearly less experienced, had pointed his aircraft in her general direction and let his gun sight's computer do the rest. He had hit her with a deflection shot that should have required expert marksmanship. The technology gap wasn't just about defensive systems on bombers. It extended to every aspect of aerial combat, turning every engagement into a mismatch where Japanese skill faced American computational precision. The intelligence reports that Major Matsumoto compiled throughout early 1945 painted a picture of technological disparity the Japanese High Command refused to acknowledge publicly. His classified assessments, restricted to officers of colonel rank and above, detailed not just the central fire control systems, but the entire ecosystem of American technological advantage. Radar systems that allowed bombers to navigate in total darkness and clouds, finding targets Japanese defenders couldn't see until bombs were already falling. Radio navigation systems that guided aircraft across thousands of miles of ocean with precision Japanese navigators using sextants and dead reckoning couldn't match. Superchargers that allowed American aircraft to operate at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to climb. Electronic countermeasures that jammed Japanese radar and radio communications. Every aspect of American air power was augmented by technology that Japanese industry couldn't produce and Japanese tactics couldn't counter. Lieutenant Tanaka received promotion to captain in April 1945, not as recognition of skill, but because so many senior officers had been killed that vacancies needed filling. Her new rank came with access to higher classification levels, and what she learned destroyed any remaining illusions about the war's outcome. The central fire control systems on B-29s were just the visible edge of American technological superiority. Behind that system lay an industrial and scientific establishment that was fighting a completely different kind of war. American aircraft manufacturers were producing planes faster than Japan could train pilots to fly.
Them. American aluminum production exceeded total Japanese metal production of all types. American aviation fuel was so abundant that training pilots received 300 hours of flight time, while Japanese pilots received 40 if they were lucky. She read reports from naval aviators who had encountered American carrier aircraft and described similar experiences with advanced fire control systems. The new F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats weren't just faster and more heavily armed than Japanese fighters. They were equipped with gun sights that made every pilot a marksman, radios that allowed coordinated tactics Japanese units couldn't match, and self-sealing fuel tanks that survived damage that would doom Japanese aircraft. One report from a Zero pilot who had survived an engagement with Corsairs noted that he had scored multiple hits on an American fighter, watched his rounds impact the fuselage and wings, and then watched the aircraft continue fighting as if nothing had happened. When he was hit once, his aircraft caught fire immediately and he barely escaped before it exploded. The self-sealing fuel tank technology alone represented a gulf in capability that explained casualty ratios Japanese command couldn't publicly acknowledge. American aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy Japanese fighters, allowing American pilots to survive mistakes and continue fighting, while Japanese pilots had one chance to avoid being hit because their aircraft would burn if struck anywhere near fuel tanks. This difference compounded over time. American pilots survived early combat, learned from their mistakes, and became more effective. Japanese pilots died in their first or second engagement, taking their hard-won training with them, forcing Japan to continuously feed inexperienced pilots into combat against increasingly experienced American aviators. Captain Tanaka was assigned to train kamikaze pilots in May 1945, a duty she accepted with profound reluctance. These young men, most barely 20 years old, received 10 hours of flight training before being sent on suicide missions. They couldn't navigate effectively, couldn't perform aerobatic maneuvers, could barely take off and land. They were being taught just enough flying skill to point their aircraft at a target and crash into it. During training lectures, she was required to emphasize the spiritual power of sacrifice, the honor of dying for the emperor, the certainty that one determined pilot could sink an American ship. She was forbidden from mentioning that American ships had radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, proximity-fused shells that exploded near aircraft without requiring direct hits, and defensive systems that made successful kamikaze attacks unlikely even for experienced pilots, which these boys were not. She broke protocol during one training session, unable to maintain the fiction any longer. Speaking to a class of 15 kamikaze candidates, she deviated from the approved curriculum and told them the truth. The Americans have technology we cannot match. Their ships will see you coming from miles away. Their guns will track you with mechanical precision. Their shells will explode near your aircraft even if gunners miss direct hits. Your chances of reaching your target are small. Your chances of surviving are zero. You are being sent to die, not because it will win the war, but because command has no other options remaining. If you choose to continue, do so with eyes open, understanding what you face. The silence that followed her words was absolute. 15 young men, some still teenagers, stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to relief. One boy, couldn't have been more than 18, raised his hand tentatively and asked the question she knew was coming. "If what you say is true, Captain, why are we doing this? Why are we being sent to die if it will not change the outcome?" She had no good answer, only the truth that military hierarchy couldn't speak. Because admitting defeat is
Lecture within hours. She was relieved of training duties, confined to quarters pending court-martial for defeatism and undermining morale. The charges were serious enough to warrant execution, but experienced pilots were too valuable to waste, even those who spoke forbidden truths. Instead, she was reassigned to a punishment duty that was effectively a death sentence. She would fly solo reconnaissance missions over American fleet positions, gathering intelligence on ship movements and defensive capabilities. The missions were nominally valuable, but everyone understood their real purpose. She was being sent to die in a manner that appeared honorable, rather than executed for speaking truth. Her first reconnaissance mission, on June 2, 1945, took her over the massive American fleet assembling at Okinawa. Flying at 30,000 feet in a stripped-down K-46 reconnaissance aircraft that traded armament for speed and altitude, she photographed hundreds of ships, more vessels than she had imagined existed in the entire world. Carriers and battleships and cruisers and destroyers and transports and supply ships, an armada so vast it seemed to cover the ocean. She counted radar antennas on every ship, anti-aircraft gun positions that bristled from every deck, combat air patrol fighters circling overhead in formations her squadron could never match. This was the force that Japanese command expected kamikaze pilots to defeat through spiritual determination and willingness to die. She returned with photographs that intelligence officers studied with expressions of resignation. They already knew the scale of American naval power, had known for months that conventional defense was impossible. The photographs simply confirmed what everyone understood but couldn't say. Japan was fighting an enemy so powerful that even seeing their full strength was demoralizing. Captain Tanaka submitted her report and waited for the next reconnaissance mission, the one that would likely kill her because reconnaissance aircraft couldn't survive forever against the defenses she had observed. But she wouldn't wait passively. She spent her evenings writing detailed accounts of what she had learned about American technology, documents she hid in her quarters against the day when someone might want to understand how the war had been lost. Her writings from June 1945 provide extraordinary insight into a military officer's perspective as the war approached its end. June 5th. The American technological advantage is not simply one system or weapon. It is a comprehensive superiority across every dimension of warfare. Their central fire control systems, their radar, their radio navigation, their computing gun sights, their industrial capacity, their fuel supplies, their training programs. Every advantage compounds others, creating a military force that operates at an efficiency level we cannot approach.
We are fighting 20th century warfare with 19th century tools and wondering why determination alone is insufficient. June 10th. Spoke with intelligence officers about American pilot training. They received 300 hours of flight instruction before combat. 300 hours. Our kamikaze pilots received 10. American pilots learned aerobatics, gunnery, navigation, formation flying, instrument flight, night operations. Our pilots learned to take off, fly straight, and crash into targets. This is not a difference in training philosophy. This is the difference between a nation that can afford to invest in pilot development and a nation that is feeding its youth into a furnace of desperation. June 15th. The kamikaze tactics are occasionally successful, but success rate is approximately 3 to 5%. 95% of pilots die accomplishing nothing beyond their own death. Command presents each success as proof the tactics work, while ignoring the overwhelming majority of failures. If we had weapons that failed 95% of the time, we would consider them defective. But when the weapons are human beings, failure is redefined as honorable sacrifice. The mathematics of attrition are inescapable. We are losing pilots faster than we can train replacements, even with training reduced to 10 hours. The Americans are losing aircraft and rebuilding their fleet faster than we can damage it. June 22nd. Received orders for
another reconnaissance mission, this time photographing American air bases in the Marianas. The islands we fought so desperately to defend are now launching platforms for hundreds of B-29s. Each base has runways longer than any in Japan, maintenance facilities that dwarf our largest arsenals, fuel storage that exceeds our national reserves. The Americans have built in 1 year what would take us a decade, and they have done it on captured islands thousands of miles from their homeland. This is what industrial supremacy looks like. They can project power and build infrastructure anywhere in the world, while we struggle to maintain facilities on our home islands. Her reconnaissance mission over Saipan and Tinian on June 25th nearly killed her when American P-51 Mustangs vectored by radar spotted her aircraft at extreme altitude. She dove for cloud cover, using every trick she had learned in 4 years of combat flying, barely escaping fighters that were faster, climbed better, and were equipped with computing gun sights that turned deflection shooting into a simple pointing exercise. She returned to base with her aircraft's engine damaged and fuel tanks nearly empty, made an emergency landing that collapsed her landing gear, and walked away from the wreckage knowing she had been impossibly lucky. The intelligence officer reviewing her photographs commented that she had captured images of over 200 B-29s parked on Tinian's airfields, more bombers than the entire Japanese Army Air Force possessed of all types. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, reached her base through fragmentary reports that seemed too catastrophic to believe. A single bomb, dropped from a single B-29, had destroyed an entire city. Initial reports suggested conventional bombing, but as details emerged, it became clear that something fundamentally new had occurred. The Americans had developed a weapon that made all previous warfare obsolete. A bomb so powerful that one aircraft could accomplish what previously required hundreds. Captain Tanaka, reading intelligence summaries about the Hiroshima attack, understood immediately that the war was over. Japan had been fighting an enemy that possessed not just superior conventional technology, but weapons that transcended conventional warfare entirely. The second atomic bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th removed any remaining doubt. America could destroy Japanese cities at will, one at a time, without risk to their aircraft or crews. Faster than Japan could evacuate or defend, the Emperor's radio address on August 15th announcing surrender surprised no one in military intelligence who understood the true situation. What surprised Captain Tanaka was how long the war had continued after its outcome became obvious. Millions had died in the final year of fighting, Japanese and American and Allied forces and civilians, in a war whose conclusion was mathematically certain to anyone examining production figures and technological capabilities. The central fire control systems, the computing gun sites, the radar networks, the industrial capacity, all of it had pointed to inevitable defeat. Yet the fighting had continued because admitting defeat was culturally impossible until ultimate weapons made denial unsustainable. During the occupation, Captain Tanaka was interviewed by American military intelligence officers interested in Japanese pilot perspectives on American technology. She provided detailed accounts of discovering central fire control systems, of training kamikaze pilots while knowing their missions were nearly hopeless, of flying reconnaissance over American bases that demonstrated industrial capacity Japan couldn't match. The American officers, initially skeptical that Japan had allowed female combat pilots, reviewed her logbook.
Technology won decisively. Your central fire control systems didn't just make bombing more accurate or defensive fire more effective. They demonstrated that machines could outperform humans in tasks we believed required human skill and courage. That realization, more than any defeat in battle, proved that our entire military philosophy was obsolete. The American officers documented her statements in reports about Japanese tactical understanding of American capabilities. One section noted that Captain Tanaka had been one of very few Japanese officers who fully understood the implications of American fire control technology, and that her attempts to modify Japanese tactics based on this understanding had been suppressed by command structure that prioritized morale over effectiveness. The report concluded that institutional barriers to acknowledging bad news had cost Japan dearly, as accurate intelligence about American capabilities existed but was classified rather than disseminated to combat units. Pilots continued dying using obsolete tactics long after better information was available, because admitting the truth would have required admitting the war was lost. In post-war years, Captain Tanaka became an aerospace engineer, working with the reconstituted Japanese aircraft industry as it rebuilt under American guidance. She specialized in